Carnivore feels powerful at first. You feel calm, focused, grounded. Anxiety drops, confidence goes up. But that clarity isn't coming from strength. It comes from something called the catecholamine honeymoon, a short phase where adrenaline and noradrenaline are elevated. It's coming from stress hormones. When you remove carbohydrates, your body rises adrenaline and cortisol to keep blood sugar stable. That stress can feel like clarity. It can feel like confidence, but it's borrowed energy. You're not producing more energy, you're compensating. Over time, the stress stays and the power fades. Energy drops, warmth disappears, and what once felt like discipline turns into burnout. So the question isn't why carnivore feels good. The question is why it eventually stops working.
And that's exactly what I'll be covering in this video. So what's up? Aleks here, and today I want to cover carnivore. As I've done a lot of calls recently, a lot of guys mentioning in the community, why do they see results with carnivore, but then they don't see optimal results? They're still struggling with certain symptoms, things like that. And that's exactly what I want to dive deep into this video. It's very popular nowadays, and yeah, let's get into it. So first things first, a lot of the things I'll be covering are in the Metabolic Dominion ebook, which there's a link in the bio. It's free to download. You can have a read. And a lot of the things that I'll be covering are covered in there. And yet, so why carnivore feels powerful and why that power fades. So first, what actually is carnivore? So for the guys that maybe don't know, let me set the foundation around what they actually believe. So carnivore is not just meat-based. It's near zero carbohydrates. There's different versions of them. I know most of them go based off of not eating carbohydrates. High fat, high protein, chronically low insulin. That's one of the goals. Often ketogenic state by default. It removes sugar, fruit, starch, fiber, any rapid glucose source. So metabolically, carnivore is a low glucose environment. This signal fact explains almost everything that follows. So when I was like 19, 18, I used to do the ketogenic diet. So the foundation around that was extremely high fat, 80%, 20% protein, and zero carbohydrates net, right? And with carnivore, the difference is they're eating a lot of protein. So it's like, and they're utilizing gluconeogenesis, so the creation of glucose from protein consumption. With the ketogenic diet, if you're to eat too much protein, it will kick you out of the ketosis state. So fundamentally, they're operating from a state of trying to get carbohydrates bought from protein, which fundamentally that way of doing things is flawed because protein should be used for structure, not for energy. And let's get into it. So let's go deeper. So what carnivore believers actually believe? Carnivore advocates generally believe carbohydrates are not required for human life. Glucose can always be made from protein, so they're utilizing gluconeogenesis. Insulin is inherently inflammatory, and fat is the body's natural fuel. Ketones are a superior brain fuel. Plants cause inflammation and autoimmune disease. Early humans thrive primarily on meat. And most importantly, if I feel better, cleaner, calmer, leaner, it must be working. That belief is understandable because carnivore does produce real effects. So if you're someone that doesn't really care about dieting and things like that, and you jump on carnivore, you will definitely see results. You'll feel better, potentially sleep better, lose body fat, build muscle if you're training, things like that. So you will see results. But what you're experiencing is the catecholamine honeymoon, and I'll get deep into that in a moment. So why carnivore does work initially? Carnivore works early because it eliminates blood sugar crashes, removes good irritants and fermentation, suppresses appetite, lowers endotoxin exposure, activates stress hormones that increase focus. So a lot of those things are valid, but accomplishing that You can do that without using Carnivore, which I'll get into and I go over into Metabolic Dominion ebook. So people experience mental clarity, reduce anxiety, reduce inflammation, stable energy, confident drive, potentially better performance in the gym, confidence, all of those things. This is not placebo, but the key question is what system is producing these effects? So there's two ways that your body can produce energy, and energy is the foundation to upholding structure in your system that then upholds different processes and things like that. So, number one, the energy metabolism. So it's thyroid driven, glucose based, high CO2 production, so carbon dioxide, efficient respiration, so you're breathing. So one of the signs or one way you can test your thyroid efficiency is how much oxygen you consume. Growth supportive, reproductive, stable. Number two, stress metabolism. So cortisol and adrenaline driven, fat and protein based, low CO2, less efficient respiration, anti-growth, anti-reproductive, short-term adaptive. Carnivore shifts the body towards stress metabolism. That does not mean it's bad. It means it's contextual. So one of the things is there's processes in our body because God created so to make us adapt in the environment that we are in. So what you're experiencing is a reaction, an adaptation to the inputs you're giving it, cause and effect, right? And the goal with like bioenergetic and things like that, you want to create a summer-like environment versus like, let's say you're living in a cold environment. Like in animals, you see this, they hibernate during the winter. So they consume a lot of polyunsaturated fats, and that sets on hibernation. And all the animals around, if they were to eat other animals, they would have high polyunsaturated fat stores because the environment is communicating a certain environment and the body adapts. Because if it was to maintain a high metabolism, you would burn through all your resources and die from starvation, right? But based on certain inputs, your body slows down, the metabolism goes down, and you survive, you know? So your body's in a state of survival. Hence why guys lose their hair, sex drive goes away, energy drive, long-term thinking, all of those things go away. And it's just focused on survival. So gluconeogenesis, so gluco, like glucose, new, Genesis, the creation, like the book of Genesis. So the pillar of carnivore. So carnivore survives on gluconeogenesis because there's certain organs in our body that operate only with glucose, with carbohydrates. It needs carbohydrates to be sustained, right? So it takes the protein you're consuming and converts it into glucose, or the protein that you have on your body, like muscle tissue, and converts that into glucose. So gluconeogenesis, converting amino acids into glucose. Important details people skip. It occurs primarily in the liver. It is hormonally driven. It requires cortisol and glucagon. It is activated under low carbohydrate stress. And repeatedly emphasize, the body makes glucose under stress, not because it prefers to, but because it must. So you see a lot of guys saying, I've seen mention, oh, you don't need, carbohydrates are not essential because if you don't consume them, you can survive. It's quite the opposite. They're so essential that when you don't consume them, your body will take the protein that you're consuming or your own muscle tissue and convert it into glucose to sustain you, right? Gluconeogenesis is not a preferred pathway. It is a backup system. And fundamentally, you don't have liver, glycogen storage, the T4 you're producing is not converting to active thyroids, it's converting to reverse T3, which then downregulates your metabolism and fundamentally downregulates all of your protective hormone production. And without active thyroid, you can produce testosterone, DHT, progesterone, none of that. Why gluconeogenesis feels good at first? Early on, cortisol keeps blood sugar stable, adrenaline increases alertness, hunger signals are suppressed, inflammatory signals are muted. Hans Selye showed that stress hormones can temporarily increase performance while quietly increasing wear. This is the resistance phase of stress. You feel powerful, but the power is borrowed. I've made posts recently how a high sex drive can be driven by stress hormones rather than protective hormones, because it's a reaction to pass on the genes before you die or whatever, Also, it can be a form of self-medicating under stress to reach orgasm because you self-medicate, right? So some things can look the same, but are driven by different components. Can be driven by protective hormones, which build up the body. Like, just the two words, like some people say there's no such thing as stress hormones and protective hormones. But there is, like, just the concept of catabolism, anabolism, catabolism to break down, anabolism to build up, and stress hormones catabolize the system, protective hormones build the system, right? Are anabolic. So the ATP question, this is where it gets real. When glucose is fully oxidized, so your body breaks down the glucose carbohydrates, you produce 30 to 32 ATP per glucose molecule. So fast ATP generation, high CO2 output, minimal oxidative stress. When fat is oxidized, so when you use fat for fuel, so beta oxidation, more ATP on paper, but slower ATP generation, requires more oxygen, produces more reactive byproducts, suppresses glucose oxidation. So it suppresses your body's ability to produce energy from glucose, and that's also known as the Randle cycle. Also, one of the reasons when bears come out of hibernation and they've been living on their body fat stores, they come out type 2 diabetic, so insulin resistant. And when they consume carbohydrates, that's compromised. So they eat honey, like fructose, to restart cell respiration. Ray Peat's framing was not ATP count, it was rate and quality of energy. Energy is not just how much ATP you can make, it's how fast, clean, and controllable that energy is. So glucose supports high rate respiration, fat supports slow, stress-adapted respiration. So CO2, one of the main things that people forget when it comes to carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, you produce carbon dioxide. So glucose metabolism produces more CO2. And CO2 is very protective. Ray Peat even mentioned that it could be more protective than like thyroid, or I know Jerchi Dinkov was talking, what do you prefer, thyroid if you could use that, or just CO2? And CO2 is up there. So CO2 stabilizes nerves, improves oxygen delivery, Burr effect. I was explaining this to a guy that was doing carnivore, and I explained you need carbohydrates just to produce CO2, because when your cells are producing energy at an efficient rate, they produce CO2 as a byproduct. And that process in itself allows for you to breathe deeper and get oxygen into the system. Hence why a high functioning thyroid state consumes more oxygen. So you breathe in oxygen, goes into the lungs, then there has to be an exchange. That's why you breathe out CO2. So then oxygen goes into the bloodstream. Then to get into the cell, there has to be CO2 in the cell to be an exchange. And the more CO2 you're producing, the more oxygen you can get into the system. And the more oxygen you have, the more energy you have to uphold the structure, energy, processes in your body. With compromised carbohydrate metabolism, that is not happening. So fat metabolism produces less CO2. So low CO2 equals nervous system instability, higher stress signaling, lower metabolism efficiency. Pete often said, so this is paraphrased, CO2 is not waste. It is a stabilizing metabolic signal. Do you ever see people who get anxiety, they back breathe? Is because they're breathing back into CO2 because CO2 is very protective. Carnivore lowers CO2 production chronically. So now the Randle cycle. So the Randle cycle shows high fatty acids inhibit glucose oxidation. So when you're consuming a lot of fats or you're under stress, so your body liberates free fatty acids into the bloodstream, it messes with your ability to utilize carbohydrates for fuel. Carnivore uses this to argue carbs are the problem, but the cycle actually shows fat dominance blocks glucose usage, not the other way around. When fat is always high, pyruvate dehydrogenase is inhibited, glucose cannot be fully oxidized, cells rely on fat and stress hormones. Carnivore creates permanent fat dominance. That is not metabolic flexibility, that is metabolic narrowing. From a bioenergetic point of view, if you're eating saturated fats, if you're eating carbohydrates, you can use both fats and carbohydrates for fuel. When you eat enough carbohydrates, your body can produce cholesterol. It can produce saturated fats from that sugar, which is protective. Ketones, survival fuel, not optimal fuel. So ketones rise when liver glycogen is depleted, insulin is suppressed, cortisol is elevated, ketosis is associated with reduced thyroid output, reduced reproductive signaling, reduced growth signaling. Sally would call this adaptation to scarcity. Ketones are useful when food is scarce. They are not a signal of abundance or safety. And personally, when I done the ketogenic diet, and I was 19, no, I was actually younger. That's when I was finishing like high school, so secondary school. I was 17. This was during the summer. I was doing the ketogenic diet. So I was eating 80% fats, 20% protein, and net like 5 grams of carbs per day net, so minus the fiber, things like that. And I remember I was just super amped up, just constantly, like you could sleep 5-6 hours and you wake up just like full of energy, but your adrenaline is super high, you're on edge constantly, super cold. I would get extremely powerful like erections morning wood, but that was driven by nitric oxide, which is stress. I remember my thyroid was extremely sore. I was losing a lot of body fat, but being extremely cold during the summer. So it's not optimal. And fundamentally with carnivore, you can't really hit pure ketogenic state if you're consuming so much protein, because one of the components of a ketogenic diet is don't consume too much protein because it will kick you out of ketosis. So why confidence, drive, and libido often rise? So when you start carnivore, you may see benefits. And when you introduce carbohydrates, you might feel quite the opposite. You're like, when I introduce carbohydrates, I just feel awful, because when you're on carnivore, you're running on stress hormones, right? And when you introduce carbohydrates, you're actually healing, but there's like a flat line, which is you're not either running on stress hormones or protective hormones, because you completely damage yourself with a stress metabolism. So you actually might go through a period of just not feeling anything, depression, you could say, or just completely neutral until you build up your protective hormones so you can run on those. And I see this a lot when guys introduce like vitamin K, aspirin, whatever it is. They lose the benefits, but because they're healing. So that's another thing you want to focus. So early carnivore often causes increased dopamine increase noradrenaline, reduce serotonin signaling, increase stress tolerance. This can feel assertive, calm, focused, alpha, but this state is driven by sympathetic, so stress dominance. Stress hormones reduce metabolic signaling. It is anti-thyroid, anti-growth, and pro-aging long-term. So the liver, where carnivore quietly breaks down. The liver, so buffers blood sugar, activates thyroid hormone. So the liver is responsible for converting your T4 inactive thyroid into T3, which is active thyroid. But under fasting or under low carbohydrate states, that T4 gets converted to reverse T3. Clears cortisol, estrogen, serotonin, detoxifies ammonia. Carnivore stresses the liver by constant amino acid deamination, ammonia production, continuous gluconeogenesis. When you look at people with severe issues, diabetes and all of those things, they're constantly in the state of gluconeogenesis. You look at type 1 diabetics. When you look at the concept of why is it when you remove carbohydrates from a type 1 diabetic, but the urine is still extremely high in glucose, is because the state of gluconeogenesis. That's why the muscle wasting comes in. You start using your own muscle tissue as carbohydrates. So poor glycogen replenishment. Low liver glycogen leads to night waking, adrenaline surges, anxiety, cold extremities, reduced thyroid function. So why the power fades? Over time, cortisol remains elevated, thyroid conversion slows, CO2 production drops, liver resilience declines, stress hormones lose effectiveness, the body moves from adaptation, compensation, exhaustion. And I see some guys mentioning, oh, but if we adapted from this 4 million years ago or whatever. I'm like, you can believe that. I personally believe we come from Adam and Eve, which there's a genealogy that goes back 6,000 years. And they were eating fruits. They've learned how to make breads and things like that, unleavened bread, which are carbohydrates. Things like that. When you look at studies with monkeys, let's say you do believe you came from monkeys. In studies, the introduction of fruit decreased cortisol levels versus the removal of carbohydrates increases cortisol. So the central bioenergetic insight. And also, like, when you're a baby, you grow on breast milk. The breast milk is extremely sweet because it fuels the metabolic rate, because your metabolism is extremely high. There's different ways you can look at it. A lot of the times, carnivore gets things right. Let's say, or don't eat green leafy vegetables because they have anti-nutrients. And that is correct, because the green part of the plant is required for photosynthesis. It's there to uphold the structure, and it's vital for the plant to grow, to get energy from sunlight. So when you break it down as an animal, it's breaking down the system. So it creates natural pesticides, you can say, to keep things from eating it. That's why it's bitter, right? But on the contrary, the fruit part is sweet. It has seeds. So when you eat it and you don't digest it, you excrete it out. It can grow to a plant. So it's a system built within itself to replenish the earth, you could say. But they don't see it from that perspective, right? So carbohydrates are extremely protective. So carnivore works by reducing variables, lowering inflammation, replacing carbohydrate metabolism with stress metabolism. It feels powerful because stress hormones increase performance, but Pete's core idea was simple. Energy supports structure, stress sacrifices structure to preserve function, and carnivore preserves function temporarily by sacrificing energy systems. So if you're someone that's entertaining carnivore, I highly recommend, first of all, downloading the free ebook, link in bio, Metabolic Dominion. And just having a look, trying it this way. Because a lot of the times the benefits you're getting is because you went from something extremely bad to something less bad. So you assume it's better for you. But I'm presenting to you something that actually works, something that upholds structure in your body. You feel good. It optimizes protective hormones and things like that. So carnivore does not increase metabolic energy. It substitutes stress for fuel. That can feel incredible until stress system can't carry the load. So that being said, hopefully you got some value out of this video. And I recommend downloading the ebook, also joining the free Brotherhood community. If you have questions, things like that, drop them down below. And yeah, I'll see you in the next video. Peace.